Day 1065 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 825,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,340 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, 6 tanks, 12 APVs, and a whopping 62 artillery. Then headed straight to the map with various Ukrainian UAV dangers declared in Voronezh and Belgorod. However, most notably today was where a massive fire erupted at a logistics and warehousing complex in Russia's Moscow region, consuming an area of 10,000 square meters. The blaze, located near Klin, home to a military base and the Klin 5 airfield, houses the 92nd Separate Special Purpose Helicopter Squadron. This unit operates various helicopter models, including the heavily armed Mi-8 and Mi-24s. So it is an incident that raises questions about potential impacts on military operations, especially given the strategic importance of this location. If this fire isn't anything more than a coincidence, it could signal deeper issues within Russia's military logistics or safety practices. Then to a brief update on recent Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil infrastructure, with some of the most recent data released in list form reporting for instance, the Kaluga region, 4 tanks with a total volume of 3,700 cubic meters filled with diesel fuel and gasoline destroyed, followed by Voronezh, 4 tanks with a total volume of 30,000 cubic meters, filled with diesel, fuel, and gasoline. And then the big one, Saratov, 12 tanks with a total volume of 60,000 cubic meters, filled with aviation kerosene in Engels. The overpass for pumping oil was also damaged. And it's a summary that sounds like an endgame, but truly, all of this would be Ukraine just gearing up, just getting started. Then headed across to Kursk as we saw the deployment of triple-rolled barbed wire from the Russian side, which is the first seen of this method in a long time by the Kremlin army. Primarily a defensive tactic, but it could be used as a means to channel attacking Ukrainian forces, funneling them into predetermined zones. Something that is, generally speaking, only necessary if Russian forces are lacking sufficient manpower. Now, an argument could also be made for its use with the disallowing of North Korean soldiers to abandon their positions and flee. Now, we haven't precisely seen that happen yet, at least not with barbed wire, but instead barrier troops. But something like this could certainly still be on the cards. Oh, and in this moment, we saw another of Russia's cutting-edge, highly specialized vehicles, the Buhanka van, getting struck by a quadcopter of the AFU, forcing Russian soldiers to duck and cover. Then as for the DPRK soldiers in the Kursk region, continued reports suggest North Korean troops are employing high casualty tactics, advancing in groups of 40 under heavy fire and across mined terrain. The methodology employed here appears to be one of relentless pushes forward, with the aim then to capture those positions only to abandon them to Russian forces before preparing for another assault. Now, the introduction of the North Korean contingent came with a lot of surprises, and yet this particular attritional approach never felt like one of them. Then on a related topic for the region, the Institute for the Study of War continues to assess that North Korea is preparing to send more troops to support Russia's war efforts into Kursk and even beyond into Ukraine. Additionally, Pentagon sources report that reinforcements could arrive within the next 2 months, following the deployment of about 12,000 North Korean soldiers last fall, where about a third to a half of that number is considered to be a combination of KIA or wounded in action now. These forces lack a high degree of specialization, or perhaps any degree of specialization, ultimately leading to their lack of utility, other than to act as perhaps one of the purest forms of a meat wave. Then headed further down the map into Ukraine, and we'll take a look at Toretsk for a moment, as was spotted today under intense shelling near to the front lines against the Russian-occupied side. With, shown in this satellite imagery, various positions and vehicles of the invader army coming under heavy Ukrainian fire. Then headed to Zaporizhia in a potential change of pace of dynamics for combat activity, as an FPV strike was recorded on a Russian Buk M3 air defense system, which is impressive in its own right. But even more impressive here was the fact that this Buk M3 was targeted 35 kilometers from the front lines by an FPV, which is extremely noteworthy and may set a record for this type of weapon, because a short-range first-person view drone was traditionally designed for frontline engagements of no more than 5 kilometers, but the times, they are a-changin'. And speaking of, not long ago there was talk of Ukraine's FPV expansion to a 20-kilometer vehicle kill zone, but as it would appear, soon the new normal could become a much further expanded range, and conceivably twice that of the 20-kilometer range, with, for example, another report of this time a Russian Tor air defense system struck 41 kilometers from the front lines, with the exact FPV drone method as well. That's almost half the distance of a HIMARS rocket. And so it's presumably all made possible in this case due to AFU heavy drone motherships offering RF comms link repeater services to extend the range of their FPVs, and in doing so, placing a new echelon of Russian equipment within their operating range, which in turn will require elements of the Russian forces to move back further from the front lines, causing a significant degradation of Russia's ability to protect its airspace and sustain its front line of military operations. Just debilitating stuff. Then also seen near to the front, a destroyed Russian T-90M tank, also in the Zaporizhia direction. Certainly a rare sight to behold these days, with Russia's production capacity of this most favourable tank of theirs possibly being produced in single-digit numbers on a monthly basis, 2 or 3, most being upgraded from the older T-90 variants. It's certainly far from replacement rate. Then to look at the map from a different angle again, a wider angle, so locked up Russian ultranationalist Igor Girkin has produced more doom posting where he declares the special military operation a failure. His analysis cuts deep, stating the following: that none of Putin's initial goals have been met, the conflict has spilled onto Russian soil, with enemy drones reaching previously untouchable areas, quite right. But most troubling, he notes, is the emergence of a well-armed, highly motivated adversary along Russia's borders. It's a candid critique from a key figure that reveals a growing disillusionment within Russian military circles. But how can Girkin send these types of messages from a Russian jail cell? Well, his messages are worded somewhat objectively and more diplomatically, not to mention without the sarcastic tone previously seen when he was more of a free man hiding somewhere in the Donbass. And so, as current, his messages, or really his messaging, has managed to squeeze through the Russian prison via means of a third party and onto Telegram. Though it is fair to expect that if he continues to get his message out, expressing these types of sentiments, he may then become subject to a new window of opportunity, be it some of Uncle Vlad Putin's finest vintage polonium tea, or utilizing a high-rise window as if it were a doorway. Outlook not so good. Then headed to Belarus, where there's been a continued trove of information coming out where it speaks of the Kremlin's long game to de facto annex the country, with concerns of this strategic move for Russia based on it using the territory as its own for economic leverage and military leverage, thereby acting as more than just a close ally. And if Putin were to take Belarus during his SMO, he could frame it as a success against the backdrop of a questionable progress from his invasion of Ukraine. And as for what the map would look like, for instance, Russia would be pressed up against Lithuania and Poland, the latter of which would be a concerning development, Given that Poland is the largest spender of defense within NATO, measured as a percentage of GDP, and done so by Poland all due to these very types of concerns of Russia's expansionist tendencies. So a Russia-Belarus annexation of this sort, combined with the motherland's closer proximity to the Russian exclave region of Kaliningrad, would leave the Kremlin likely strongly considering a land corridor through annexed Belarus to Kaliningrad, and opting to more likely go the Lithuanian route as opposed to the decidedly more militarized Polish route. So this hypothetical, or let's say more than slightly hypothetical, annexation of Belarus would mark a significant change in the state of Europe's national security dynamics. However, if not for these countries being NATO members, then these types of Russian movements could have already conceivably occurred. Then headed right down on the map to the Mediterranean, where Syria's new government has cancelled a 2019 agreement with Russia and the Russian company Stray Transgas, stripping Moscow of its 49-year lease of the Tartus port, Russia's only foreign naval base. All port revenues will now benefit the Syrian state, marking a decisive move away from the Assad-era pact. Syrian authorities also confiscated the port's cargo, which included pickups intended for the Russian forces, where these vehicles were subsequently transferred to the Syrian army. So these developments not only restrict Russia's military presence in the Mediterranean, but also signals a potential realignment in Syrian foreign relations. Then headed across to some news for today, and we'll start out with some Ukrainian hardware news, because the innovation continues. As prominent Ukrainian military figure Madar displays a 41-kilometer spool for a fiber-optic cabled heavy hexacopter FPV drone, able to carry a powerful shaped charged warhead. With an extended range like this, usually seeing a large concentration of Russian air defense systems, as we saw before, but also MLRS and command points and so on. So it's a whole new target set that would have previously needed a scarce HIMARS rocket or precision shell to engage, like the Excalibur, positions of which are now at risk to considerably cheaper FPVs. Madar also spoke at length about the advantages of fiber optics for all sorts of use cases, and how his unit is now printing and rewinding fiber on their own spools. So Ukraine continues to push the boundaries with what they can achieve with all of their drone warfare designs. They never stop innovating. Then headed across to some Russian hardware news with some Russian innovation, cutting costs it would appear, as Russian artillery units reportedly continue to face significant problems with inconsistently filled propellant charges for their artillery shells, which is wreaking havoc on their artillerists' accuracy and range. Despite the obvious fix for better quality control measures, the Russian General Staff has another fix entirely, prohibiting gunners from addressing the issues themselves. Reports from the Russian Telegram channel Ambush Scholar reveals ongoing complaints about the quality of ammunition, with artillerymen weighing charges even within the same batches in an attempt to achieve some modicum of precision. And so it's a situation that not only undermines battlefield effectiveness, but also highlights some of Russia's broader vulnerabilities that could be exploited by its neighboring adversary. Oh, then in some more Russian hardware news, Russia has just received delivery of its latest North Korean provided super weapon, as a 122mm MLRS, so the multiple launch rocket system, disguised as a civilian truck, has been spotted in Kursk. These MLRS systems were first showcased in 2023 during a military parade in Pyongyang, and not that it matters to Russia, but disguising a weapons platform as civilian is a war crime, accounting for multiple breaches of international law, including the Geneva Convention, the ICC, international humanitarian law as well, and a bunch more. Now, as for this platform, sometimes known as the BM-24, is a 12-tube design, which can therefore be considered as something of a downgrade to Russia's BM-21s and BM-27s, which contain 16 or 40 tubes, and a caliber of roughly twice the size of this North Korean variant. Also, the truck is likely to stick out like a sore thumb and would likely have some concerns when it comes to driving through different variations of terrain, especially around this time of year. Then to some more news, and in a potentially surprising turn, President Trump has intensified his rhetoric against the Kremlin, issuing a stark ultimatum, it would seem. Either come to the peace negotiating table or brace for escalating taxes, tariffs, and sanctions, aimed at an already crumbling Russian economy. Now, the Trump administration has previously made it known that Russia is going to have to make some concessions, and saying it of both sides, to be fair. Yet, concessions on the Russian side would likely look like a loss of some Ukrainian territory, combined with many tens of thousands, possibly 100,000 or more peacekeeping troops stationed between Ukraine and Russia. Now, Russia has a few demands, and I'm reminded of another one where Russia has demanded in the past that the Ukrainian army, being to be no larger than about 85,000 soldiers strong, something that in this geopolitical dynamic is not likely to materialize. It doesn't make any sense. But overall, there will be difficulty for both sides to meet in the middle, and it's all easier said than done. But it remains to be seen how the Kremlin will respond here to these Trump remarks, really seeming to be an ultimatum, with, at the same time, the Kremlin looking to make whatever outcome happens to look like a win for Russia. That would surely be difficult. However, in some ways, Putin should consider it a win to gain some economic sanction relief out of negotiations, with some of the irony there being that Russia would be negotiating for something that actually didn't exist before the SMO began. Apart from the considerably smaller sanctions imposed due to the 2014 Crimea annexation. So imagine that, Russia negotiating for something that wasn't even a problem pre-war. Then headed across to a little bit of Russian economy news, as China has started to decrease its buying of Russian coal supplies, instead for Australian and Mongolian coal, due to the comparatively higher cost of the Russian coal. Now, this change that was attributed to the higher cost associated with the Russian coal has been influenced by production expenses and logistical challenges by rail, and of course, those pesky economic sanctions. And yet, the Chinese preference here should be considered an unusual move for China, who, take for example, has now started purchasing coal from Australia at record volumes following a period of unofficial restrictions against the land down under that started back in 2020. Meanwhile, Russia-China relations had just 2 or 3 days ago announced how their bilateral ties were elevating to new heights, as per a conference call between both their leaders. So this China-Russia promoted friendship without limits, quote unquote, lacks any real unity, trust, or preferential treatment. Just more of a case of simply talking the talk, as I've mentioned before. Instead, China has found a way to save an extra buck at the cost of placing limits on that so-called friendship without. And every day seeming more like a friendship of convenience until it is no longer. So that has to be it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Got a little bit held up over the last couple of days, but should be back to normal. So thanks for sticking around, and please continue to like, comment, subscribe, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!